that had been standing for centuries, and the consequences are still shaking the world. At exactly 2:45 p.m., the Ouagadougou African Union Summit Hall literally turned into a battlefield when Traoré stepped up to the podium. The hall was silent, but 3 minutes later the French ambassador jumped up and stormed out of the hall, followed by the Belgian ambassador running after him. The British representative grabbed his phone and urgently called Washington. The German diplomat gathered his files and headed for the exit. But what was truly shocking was the reaction of the African leaders who remained in the hall. The Malian president stood up and began applauding. The Niger leader raised his fist in the air. The Chadian representative saluted Traoré with tears in his eyes, because what was said that day was not just a speech, it was a complete revolution. So what did Traoré say that day that made world diplomats flee the hall in panic? France call an emergency meeting? America demand CIA reports? And the European Union establish a crisis? Desk Traoré began his speech with their words. Some representatives sitting in this hall are here for the last time today, because now I will show the true face of Africa, and no one will be able to escape these truths. These words had a bomb effect in the hall. The French ambassador immediately started whispering with his advisor. The Belgian representative began shuffling through his documents. Traoré continued. The story of poor Africa that has been told to you for years is completely false. 800 tons of gold are extracted from Burkina Faso lands. Every year, this gold is worth $45 billion annually, but only 12% of this money stays in our country. Where does the rest go? When he asked this question, the French ambassador stood up and began preparing to leave the hall when he came to the uranium issue. Complete chaos began. Traoré said that with the uranium extracted in Burkina Faso, 4,600 nuclear reactors could be operated. 37 of France's 58 nuclear reactors run on our uranium. But what do we get in return? France earns $78 billion annually. By selling electricity, we receive only 450 million euros. When he heard these figures, the French ambassador could no longer stand it. He jumped up and left the hall, but Traoré did not stop. He continued. He looked at the Belgian representative and said, "Without the cobalt extracted from Congo, not a single mobile phone can be produced in the world. Not a single electric vehicle can work. But the Congolese people do not see this wealth. Belgian companies earn $23 billion annually. Congo is paid only $340 million. The Belgian ambassador also could not stand it and packed up and left. Only African leaders and a few brave European diplomats remained in the hall. But Traoré, as real bomb, had not yet come when he started talking about the CFA franc system. The remaining European diplomats also began to feel uncomfortable. 14 African countries use the CFA franc, and 50% of these currencies are held in the French central bank. He said, "Do you know what this means? These countries cannot even freely use their own money. They need permission from France for every expenditure." The Malian president stood up and shouted, "You speak the truth, brother. These chains must be broken." The Niger leader added, "Our oil runs their factories, but our people live in darkness." Traoré then dropped his real bomb. He raised the file in his hand and said, "This file contains the complete list of resources stolen from Africa. Since 1960, the total amount is $47 trillion. With this money, we could have made all of Africa 10 times more developed than Dubai. But this money is now in European banks, in American company vaults." The remaining German diplomat also packed up after hearing their figures. Now only African leaders remained in the hall, and the real conversation began. Then Traoré turned to the African leaders and said, "The game is over, brothers. This system has been exploiting us for 400 years, but today it ends as Mali and Burkina Faso. We are establishing a common currency. We are leaving the CFA franc, and we will manage our own resources ourselves. This announcement brought standing applause in the hall, because this was not just an economic decision. It was a complete declaration of independence. The Ghanaian president took the floor and said, "We also want to join this union. We will write our own destiny from now on." But TRS statements were not finished. Yet his most shocking statement was, "This agreement's made with China, and Russia will no longer be in dollars, but in direct resource exchange our gold for their technology, our uranium for their nuclear technology." This statement rang alarm bells in Washington. When the speech ended, there was applause in the hall for minutes, but the real event happened after the speech ended, when the television cameras turned off. Traoré gave a special interview with journalists and made even more shocking statements. There, the first reaction after this speech came from France. Macron called an emergency security meeting. The foreign ministry established a crisis desk in a statement from the Elysee Palace. It was claimed that Burkina Faso violated international law. America also took action. The CI Africa desk prepared urgent reports. The Pentagon began evaluating military intervention options in the region, because this was not just Burkina Faso's decision. It meant the entire Sahel region breaking away from the West. Germany was also in panic, because German companies were earning 127 billion euros annually. With raw materials extracted from Africa, the collapse of this system would deeply shake the German economy. Britain also took action because there was a possibility of former colonies like Ghana and Nigeria joining this movement. This would endanger British companies' $340 billion investment in Africa. But what was truly shocking was the media's reaction. BBC, CNN, France 24, and other major media organizations barely covered this speech. They just glossed over it with short news because what Traoré said turned the entire system upside down. The documents Traoré revealed were indeed shocking. 40% of the world's cocoa comes from Ivory Coast, but Ivory Coast gets only 3% share from this trade. The remaining money goes to European companies. Gold extracted from Ghana is worth $67 billion annually, but Ghana is paid only $2.8 billion. The Angolan people never see this wealth. The most striking example is Democratic Republic of Congo, the world's richest country in terms of 67 strategic minerals. Its people are among the world's poorest. How can this contradiction be explained? Traoré gave the answer to this question. Because the system is set up this way. We sell raw materials, they process and sell at 50 times the value in the days. Following the speech, developments accelerated. The Malian president announced his support for Traoré. The Niger leader also made similar statements. Chad also stated that it wanted to join this movement. Ghana also made a surprising decision and announced that it would evaluate its gold reserves in yuan instead of dollars. This decision affected gold prices on the London and New York stock exchanges. Support also came from Senegal, because Senegal was one of the countries using the CFA franc and wanted to get rid of this system, but France immediately intervened and began applying economic pressure on Senegal. In response to those developments, the European Union held an emergency meeting and decided to develop a new strategy for Africa, because the current system was collapsing and a new approach was needed. The biggest development after Traoré's speech occurred in the technology field. China announced that it would transfer 5G technology to Burkina Faso. Russia also offered cooperation on nuclear technology. These agreements posed a major threat to the West because Africa as technological independence could end Western supremacy. NATO was particularly concerned about nuclear technology transfer. Another truth to revealed was water resources. 30% of the world's freshwater reserves are in Africa, but the right to benefit from these waters is largely held by international companies. This could be the source of major conflicts in the future. In the weeks following the speech, major changes began in Burkina Faso. French companies' mining licenses were cancelled. French military bases were closed. Russian military advisors came to the country. These developments put France in a difficult position because the uranium it obtained from Burkina Faso was critical for France as energy security. Without this uranium, France's nuclear power plants could not operate. Germany was also worried because the gold it imported from Burkina Faso was indispensable for the German jewelry industry. The cutting of this trade would affect thousands of German workers. America also changed strategy and decided to strengthen the Africa Command in Africa because it did not want to lose its influence in the region. The most important result of TR's speech was the attitude of the African Union. The African Union held an emergency meeting announcing its support for Traoré as statements and demanded that member countries act jointly to protect their resources. This decision created a domino effect throughout Africa. Tanzania decided to nationalize its gold mines. Zambia limited foreign companies' shares in copper mines. Botswana introduced new rules in diamond trade. South Africa also supported this movement and prepared plans to reclaim the resources it lost during the post-apartheid period. Nelson Mandela's dream was coming true. Africa was. Finally, achieving real independence, the biggest change after TR's speech occurred in education. African history became a mandatory course in all universities in Burkina Faso. The realities of the colonial period were added to the curriculum. This education reform also set an example for other African countries, because the new generation should know the truths and not repeat the same mistakes. The most striking development after the speech was the reaction of the African diaspora. African origin citizens living in America launched a campaign to support Traoré. The African diaspora in 2000 Europe also organized similar campaigns. This support was not just moral but also economic. The African diaspora was making $40 billion in annual money transfers, and this money started to be sent directly to African banks instead of Western banks. Traoré's speech also had consequences in terms of international law filing a lawsuit, with the International Court of Justice for the return of resources stolen during the colonial period was on the agenda. If this case is accepted, it will set a historic precedent. The most secret development after the speech was the intelligence war. While the CIA was trying to infiltrate Burkina Faso, Russian intelligence services also became active in the region. This secret war would determine Africa as Fight 2 as security team prevented 3 assassination attempts at the last minute. The first attempt occurred just 48 hours after the speech. 2 people with French passports were caught at Ouagadougou airport with weapons and fake documents. The second attempt was more sophisticated. An agent who came under the guise of a German technology company representative was caught in a building near Traoré's residence. He had long-range sniper rifle parts on him. The third attempt was the most dangerous. British agents trying to infiltrate the central bank of Burkina Faso were trying to steal the codes of the new monetary system. This attempt showed how effective Traoré's speech was. Thus, assassination attempts were experienced not only in Burkina Faso, but also in Mali and Niger, because the 3 countries were now acting as a single bloc. And this unity was a major threat to the West. Among the documents Traoré revealed, the most shocking were oil agreements. 78% of Chad's oil goes directly to France. But Chad's share from this oil is only $12 per barrel. The same oil is sold for $95 in Europe. The story of natural gas extracted from Nigeria is even more bitter. Shell Company has been extracting gas from Nigeria for 60 years. but compensation for environmental damage has never been paid. 20 million people living in the Niger Delta are victims of this pollution. Tax evasion methods of oil companies in Angola are a complete scandal. From the annual $89 billion oil revenue, only $23 billion remains in Angola. The remaining money is kept hidden in tax havens. The child labor scandal in cobalt mines in Congo was on the world agenda, but no Western company took responsibility. 6 out of every 10 mobile phones produced in the world are made with Congolese cobalt. But Congolese children cannot go to school. Where did the documents Traoré used when revealing the truths come from? Some of these documents came from WikiLeaks-style leaks. However, most were the fruits of 20 years of work. By African Counts Intelligence Services, Mali Intelligence Service had seized French companies' financial records. Niger Intelligence Organization had documented irregularities in uranium trade. Burkina Faso intelligence had exposed the entire network of gold smuggling. This intelligence cooperation was not only economic, but also had a military dimension. The 3 countries decided to establish a joint air defense system. Russian-made S-300 systems were brought to the region. China also played an active role in this process. Huawei company announced that it would build fiber-optic internet infrastructure to the 3 countries. This infrastructure was the first step of Africa as digital independence. The country that experienced the biggest panic after Traoré's speech was France, because all its influence in Africa was ending. The French foreign minister began making urgent African tours, but it was already too late. The president of Ivory Coast had announced his support for France. People took to the streets and supported Traoré. Similar demonstrations were held in Dakar. Support rallies for Traoré were organized even in Morocco. The European Parliament held an emergency session to discuss the African issue. However, the decisions taken were only within the framework of diplomatic courtesy, because it was too late to intervene. America also changed strategy. The Biden administration announced a $60 billion investment package to Africa. However, this package was also a continuation of the colonial system, because it was again based on the logic of buying raw materials and selling technology. The echoes of Traoré's speech in Asia were also great. India announced that it would triple its trade volume with Africa. Japan also promised to make technology transfer to Africa. However, the biggest support came from an unexpected place. Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, and Bolivia announced their support for Traoré because they had also experienced similar exploitation. Brazil went even further and proposed establishing a common currency with African countries. This proposal was also supported by BRICS countries. Among the figures Traoré revealed, the most striking was in the field of education. The literacy rate in Africa is low, but the reason is not being poor, but systematic sabotage, for example, in Burkina Faso. The budget allocated to education annually is $340 million. But the value of gold extracted from the country is $23 billion. If only 5% of gold income is allocated to education, all children in Burkina Faso can receive world-standard education. The same situation applies in the health field. 2 million children die from treatable diseases in Africa every year. But with the precious minerals extracted from the same lands, the health system of all Africa can be brought to world standards. The most important point Traoré emphasized was Africa as potential. If managed correctly, Africa can become the world's richest continent by 2050. Because it has unique advantages in terms of young population and natural resources in the period following the speech. Technology transfer accelerated. Engineers from China began building solar power plants in Burkina Faso. Experts from Russia built uranium processing facilities. Thus, developments threatened the West as energy security, because if Africa started processing its own resources, it could stop selling raw materials to Europe. Germany had foreseen this situation and began offering alternative proposals to Africa. German companies promised to build factories in Africa, but the control of these factories would still remain in Germany. Britain also tried similar tactics. It offered special status to Commonwealth countries. But African leaders were now seeing these games after Traoré as speech. A media war also began. Western media organizations tried to portray Traoré as a dictator, but African media continued to spread the truth. A great war was also experienced on social media. Twitter and Facebook began restricting posts about Traoré, but African youth continued to share the truth on TikTok. This digital censorship further strengthened anti-Western feelings in Africa, because the attempt to hide the truth proved Traoré's economic war had also begun. The World Bank stopped lending to Burkina Faso. IMF suspended aid, but China and Russia stepped in to fill this gap. The African Development Bank also played an important role and began providing financing to Traoré's projects. This situation broke the monopoly of Western financial institutions in Africa. The longest-term effect of Traoré's speech was the awakening of African consciousness. Now African youth began to learn their own history and discovered their own values. This consciousness awakening had not only economic but also cultural dimensions. African music, African art, African philosophy were being rediscovered. So what do you think is straw? Right, or is this too radical an approach? Is this change really good for Africa? Or will it create chaos? Do not forget to share your thoughts in the comments, because this story is just beginning and your opinions are also very important.